Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another 2MK Kame House lobby. So the patch is here, and there are some tiny shakeups to the tiers. We don't care about tiers that much. We care about what the shakeup means to the play of the character and what you need to learn, or what you need to unlearn, because it's no longer necessary. Therefore, since this week we have, as usual, all 5 of our play styles in the lounge, feel free to join in. This is a loser stays on lobby, US East Coast 2. It is in ring match priority lobby 02. And the code to join us, we are standing in front of Kame House as always, is 2717. If you forget it, the information is both in our tweet at Twitter 2_MK_FGC and should be in the stream title. So even if you're a complete beginner, feel free to join in once you feel you've listened enough and decided what you want to work on. And we'll do our best to help you work on it. But as is customary, after a shift in the game, my part is to mostly repeat things that I've been talking about in previous weeks to help everyone remember where to get their style of play from and what to do to progress through the various layers you need to grow in the game. I may be talking about those things in a slightly different order because, once again, we generally assume that people have gotten enough information by poking at the game or watching things online or even previous streams. But, once again, the first thing to remember is blocking, because blocking is relatively strong in this game. Yes, you can be beaten by dragon rushes, but dragon rushes are relatively easy to tech or otherwise deal with, whereas blocking forces your opponent to do much more work than you. We're assuming that by now you probably know your character. If you're entering our lounge and don't really feel like you understand what character you want to play, or are having a character crisis, just let us know and I can probably go into that. But for now, we will be dealing primarily with how to defend yourself and where you can go after that, the way this game works and the way to think about it. So point 1 is blocking, because unlike most games where you try to figure out whether or not it's your turn by hitting a button, in Dragon Ball FighterZ, you block as long as you can. Be ready to hit a button to attack if you see a green flash, for example. But for the most part, you block as much as you can and wait for your opponent to put themselves in a spacing where you don't think they can keep attacking. Once they're there, then you hit your button and test out whether or not they really had to stop or if you have the right choice of counterattack. But you should generally block more in this game than you do in most games. The second aspect of that is deflecting, which is what you do when you realize your opponent gets to keep attacking. They did move out to a space and somehow they keep on winning when you hit a button. This generally means that you could deflect. That is holding back and pressing special. You're already holding back, so just hit special. This works primarily because if your opponent has pushed themselves out, there's no chance of you being in a true block string. You just probably didn't have a button that reached. And if you don't feel as if your character has any fast enough attack that will reach, and therefore your opponent is basically going to come back in for free, just deflect. The worst that will happen is that they'll read it and slow themselves down, which brings you back to where you wanted to be. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. If your opponent is continually attacking, you should just generally block. And when you don't know if they can counterattack you anymore, because they are in a space that you're not sure you can reach in time, then use your deflect instead of either blocking more or hitting a button. Once you've got that down, you should be able to move forward in terms of your own plans fairly well. Looks like we've temporarily lost our Brawly player. Who also plays Android 16, there might have been some sort of bug, but probably not, most likely just some connection issue. And we will get back to talking about those characters later on. Another good defensive perspective is that once you've been knocked up into the air in a way that you don't understand in the corner, use your meter to vanish out on your recovery rather than trying to actually land normally. This will corner your opponent, allow you to switch. If it lands like that, get some time to save yourself and rethink your situation. So if you feel as if you're pressured and you don't know how to deal with a particular opponent, especially if they're good at cornering you, save some meter for this purpose because it will force them to use a lot of heavy combos that don't require you to actually get out of corner pressure. They'll just go for big damage if they can. This is actually much more stressful and difficult to do, so you're increasing the amount of work your opponent must do quite a lot. It is at that point that you can start to understand matchups and get an idea for how your matchups are going to go. Characters who leave themselves close to you at the end of their block string, such as Gohan, can often just be deflected, or you can just jump out of them. This allows you to play this game's equivalent of footsies and not have to worry so much. Once you gain the idea and understanding of the positioning allowed in the game, it's a lot clearer how to defend yourself and how to push your opponent back. It's also often possible when your opponent has gone too high in the air after one of their corner things to vanish and save yourself that way anyway. Similarly, if they have cornered you with their own vanish, vanishing yourself on watching their approach is often a good way to get out, even though it won't normally hit them, because they will have been holding forward and functionally be blocking. It's much easier to use a level 3 or something similar to freak out your opponent, especially if you happen to have one that covers a lot of space. Once you become comfortable enough with the spacing and flow of the game, it's a lot easier to bring over your skills from other games, such as your zoning, your rushdown, your footsies, because you get to spend more time understanding the opponent's positions rather than trying to get out of pressure and generally frustrating yourself. So if you want a good way to level up, that is how you start. Make sure you block enough that your opponent has to rethink their attack strings. And even if you do get hit by them because you have been blocking and they open you up, it's often true that you take more damage for attempting a full counterattack than you do for blocking incorrectly and falling into one of their mix-ups. The majority of the characters in the game do not have strong enough mix-ups to force you to take heavy damage after them without a ton of meter and usually a lot of scaling. One relatively well-known change is that there has been a change to Adult Gohan's rapid legs attack in terms of how much pressure you can use after it. That's really all you need to understand in the strict sense of changes to the game. The pressure after that is different, which means, once again, block more. Note that Teen Gohan functionally wasn't that strong in that move to begin with, and therefore there wasn't any real need to change it much. As you can see here, it takes a lot more effort and spends a lot more time doing very little damage for the amount of meter that is often used when you put more effort into making sure you don't get opened up easily. Of course, that has always been effectively true to the lore. Dragon Ball as a anime concept often involves a lot of very skilled blocking. So, if you're a fan of the game, if you're a fan of the show, you can just remember it that way. If the game feels weird to you, just think about how many characters and how many situations in the show really are just people either blocking or doing that thing where that looks like a Dragon Rush tech, which is functionally still mostly more blocking. It is also a better way to learn about your opponent's characters than generally just trying to hit stuff to get your own stuff started. You will learn too little about your opponent's characters that way. So above all, don't let trying to get out of pressure eat up all your focus in this game. Be true to the spirit of the Dragon Ball world and block your attacks. Well, their attacks. Once you have managed to block enough attacks, you can start thinking about matchups and mix-ups, as well as the correct uses of your meter. We'll mostly be discussing matchups and so on later into the stream, but it does tie in somewhat with the concept of using your meter to switch out when you need it, and using it to finish people off with your vanish when you need that. It's easy to feel as if the best way to play the game is to use your meter on big attacks and to finish your opponent off with combined supers and so on. These things are good, and you do build up enough meter that you will get your opportunities for this, but you should also consider which of your characters need the most meter in order to be effective, and, more importantly, whether or not you need your vanish often in certain matchups. We'll be discussing later how you can tell whether or not you should be using your vanish in matchups, because it is a relatively different sort of decision than the matchup itself. It is what decides things like who is your main point character, how much effort you put into keeping certain characters alive to help you with assists, and so on. Overall though, the main thing you want to try to remember is, do I need meter to defend myself in this matchup, or should I use it to get offense and damage and force the opponent to shift? There may be times where you may need to give up a really good long combo that you could do in order to make sure that once you have dropped back into neutral, that you have a way to deal with the opponent. Since supers and general uses of meter can sometimes be relatively small payoff for the amount of meter you invest, being able to keep yourself safe in neutral may be a better option altogether. Do your best to think about this in a very simple sense. Do I need meter to get out of the corner? Do I need meter to do anything in particular? If not, you're probably good. Once you've managed to get all that in your mind, the thing that generally is making the decision, well, no, the thing that is deciding whether or not you win the match is often how well your assists cover the space that you are not currently in or aren't currently covering, and you can use that information to finish out and round out your fighting style if you understand your characters well enough. Finally, once you've worked out all of that and understand your matchups as well as your characters, you will be able to finalize your fighting style by adding in planning and strategic decisions regarding which characters are allowed to fall, how much meter you need to devote to them being on the screen, how much time you need to spend trying to get enough meter to make a particular character effective, and so on. Mostly you should try not to jump ahead of yourself and spend too much time learning things like long combos, though they are useful, without understanding how to get into the position to start them, or whether or not they are worth the meter usage. Training in a vacuum can often cause this problem. So do make sure that even if you don't have anyone directly to train with and end up having to play online or use the training mode quite often, that the things on your mind are more so about whether or not you will have the meter. So if you're going to learn combos, at least make sure you have a couple of good ones that don't require much meter usage, if at all, and have advantageous endings for you. Broly got some things that seem like nerfs and some things that are very slight buffs. It's difficult to understand on a base level how Broly's changes will affect much other than his ability to combo things. So, as a beginner or even moving into intermediate play, I don't think one should spend too much time worried about this as yet. You worry about that when you are higher tier and have to try to minimize the number of interactions you need to win with Broly, i.e. maximizing your damage. Android 16 has lost a hard knockdown on his various dunks, which is a fairly big nerf to him. But the sort of player who understands the oppression required to play the character is probably just going to come up with something else. It may mean that he has more synergy as a starter who needs assists to help him than he did before, where he was relatively good at just stomping on people when he was being called in and expecting a lot of good stuff to happen after that. So you have to be a little bit more aware and a little bit more devoted to being oppressive with him or moving back out and zoning. So he's closer to Potemkin now, or to Laura, I guess, or Alex from Street Fighter, than he has generally been before. Broly's situation is similar in that he now depends a lot more on his assists than before. And and therefore playing those characters requires that you understand how they can assist each other if you're playing both, or have a very clear understanding of what your assists do, more so than in spending time learning your combos. But we will definitely be going through matchup concepts throughout the stream. For now, of course, just enjoy the demonstrations of the results of strong defense. And proper use of meter.
本当に大切なものを守るには強くなくちゃいけないんだ。
The outcome of this fight is anybody's guess! Ready? Fight! 絶対に許さんぞ。そろそろ死にたいだろ。絶対に許さんぞ。生意気だよお前。死ね。虫けらが。もう終わりか。虫けらが。絶対に許さんぞ。虫けら。なるほど。そろそろ本気を出しましょう。
The one thing that this does change for Broly is that he is much less capable of dealing with Frieza's warp attack. Frieza's down special will move him across the screen in such a way that he will end up either in front of or behind the opponent. He moves a fixed distance, but does not specifically home in or lock on anywhere. This is actually more useful for evading Broly's movement, and it often helps him do this entirely. Similar to Goku being able to use the instant transmission version of his Kamehameha to deal with both Broly and 16, because they tend to spend a lot of time in positions where he can hit them with it. Since Goku is good at zoning them away from himself, it is easy to do this. Similar things happen when Goku Black is using the command grab version of the Kamehameha, since he has no up and down that can be used there. This is less effective on Cell because Cell doesn't tend to be on the ground, but it's not really because Cell is good at avoiding the attack while doing anything else. So you can definitely count on zoning capacity as a whole in this game for those characters, if you can understand when your opponent's attack strings are going to end. Oppressive characters, however, are not very easy to understand in this way, and you tend to have to be a little bit more clear on where you want to be on the screen rather than trying to figure out what you want to do to the enemy. In short, defending against these characters by trying to block them is generally a losing battle. You need to move around and understand where you want to be, and try to make your opponent not understand where you want to be, so that you can do things like recognize this is the moment they're about to attack me, this is the moment I can use my Kamehameha or warp attack or anything else. Against most characters, you're only able to use your Vanish. But against this particular group, you get to use your various teleportations.
パワーレーダーに反応がまだ孫悟空は生きているすまない俺はまだ壊れるわけにはいかないのだ
Because oppressive characters and grapplers in games generally violate the concept that you can just block, your next option of defense is, as mentioned before, to move. However, an offensive mix-up character such as Kid Buu generally doesn't do this as well, and their strength is predicated around the fact that you can't be absolutely sure where they are going to strike from. Their style depends a lot more on your reactions, and therefore moving is somewhat helpful, especially neutral movement, straight up into the air or whatever. Deflection is much more helpful, but can often be mistimed, leading to you being very stressed. Overall though, if you are worried about not being able to block, your best bet is usually to try to deflect. Another option that will often help you against this form of character is the fact that when they are knocking you around, if you don't instantly recover, it can mess up their flow. There is a relatively large amount of delay you can have on how quickly you want to recover out of being knocked down or whatever. So, hitting buttons too early into your own recovery will make you predictable, and you should at least somewhat consider not acting immediately when you do get hit, because it will help you shift their attack timing relative to your defense. If you find this difficult emotionally, I suggest that you train it in training mode, because in real matches it is harder to keep the mental state required to not instantly recover out of things. But as you can see here, instant recovery tends to lead to getting hit by the same Gohan mix-up over and over. Overall, when placed under stress by this type of character, your best bet is to try to relax as much as possible and just accept that they're hitting you. It is their nature to be as stressful as possible, and this is often what gives the impression that they are top tier or just generally strong. Characters known to have this feeling are Kid Buu, Cell, Adult Gohan, sometimes Tien depending on who's playing them, and Goku Black to some extent.
なるほどなるほどこれはどうその程度なのですかはいとこれでそのこれで絶対に許さんぞ大丈夫かこれならどうだこれでどうですもっと見せてくれその程度はどうそのこれでどうです甘いよ後悔しますよさあ行くよ大丈夫よろしくどうですこれは頼むよこっちから行くよそこそこおっとこちらですそここっちから行くよこっちだよまだまだだねなるほどこっちだよ
As you can see, Beerus deals with this matchup by staying in the air where Frieza cannot get to him. Depending on your assists, you may be able to solve this problem. And depending on how quickly you can super dash, you may also be able to solve it that way. Spacing yourself correctly against Beerus to prevent him from being able to get a whole ton out of that is very important, and understanding that he will probably jump back to save himself and solve the problem is also very important. If you feel uncomfortable trying to catch Beerus on his own backward movement, it will be difficult to play this matchup. He's therefore another character who is difficult somewhat to defend against, and you have to think about how to get your offense started against him, more so than how to defend. Goku, however, obviously has a strong option in his ability to use his Kamehameha to get out, and Goku Black similarly has some very strong options in terms of using his own warp and certain moves that cross the screen from mid-air that Beerus has a little more trouble stopping or avoiding. The decision as to which of those characters you need often comes down to whether or not the Beerus player's rhythm indicates that they were going to come forward after setting up their orbs, and therefore you tend to need Goku himself, or if they're going to try to retreat more and stay out of range and bombard you with more of them, in which case you usually need Goku Black. When backed up but to the point where he can get enough meter from his allies, or just generally in a team with Tien Shinhan. Teen Gohan also gives the same feeling as Kid Buu and the others because there are so many characters that are good at popping you up into the air, where Teen Gohan's mix-ups become more effective and more real, let's say. It is difficult to make sure that you can't be hit by him, and you do have to think quite often about whether or not to recover quickly. If you find yourself mashing buttons out of Teen Gohan pressure, he's just going to keep hitting you because most Teen Gohan moves work better when you are trying to recover out of his attacks. This is complicated by the fact that if you recover too early and Teen Gohan was not likely to hit you, most likely the player knows that this is going to happen and is going to cover the space with their assists. Which brings us to the point of covering space with assists. Frieza is a good example of where this is very helpful because Frieza needs time to recover from certain moves in ways that often give the opponent a chance to approach him. With the correct assists on the team, Frieza can defend himself in those situations without having to worry about it too much. When playing characters who rely on reacting to opponents' movement with specific positionings, it becomes difficult to defeat other defensive players when you are playing very defensively yourself. It gives them a long time to think about it, whereas you must always be on edge to figure out whether or not you need to be ready to do thing A or thing B. If you find yourself in this situation, you should possibly consider that the characters you're playing, or the assists and the way you're using them, may not be sufficient for your goals. Alternately, you should consider whether or not your goals of defending in that particular way are the correct ones to be aiming for. If that is your style, switch your characters. If that is not your style, figure out why it is that you find yourself defending that much, or rather defending in that way. Similarly, from the offense player's perspective, if you realize that the best thing for you to do a lot of the time against a particular opponent is to stop attacking because they're defending so well, but Rel is just not doing anything, it may imply that you don't have sufficiently oppressive or sufficiently mixed up rushdown style characters for your goals and need to rethink those goals or change characters. Frieza is a good example of this because Frieza needs assists who will help him keep the zoning going, because he simply can't keep on throwing out zoning attacks and expecting it to work on its own. He either must warp or call in a helper while he repositions. Fortunately, Frieza is good at buying time, so he tends to have his assists available fairly constantly. Zoning in this game often requires a fairly close understanding of your assists and when you can rely on them and what you should be able to do after they have actually landed their attack. If you decide to play extremely defensive zoning, your assists usually are not much use because you tend to only use them to land one more extra hit, but don't actually end up moving yourself, so the opponent just keeps on doing the same thing. If you find that your general response to that emotionally is, well, I just don't want to attack, this is not necessarily a game in which zoners can just not attack. Because of the way their zoning works, it tends to be something that many players can get around if they see it coming. This is often true in other games, but for most other games, the spacing required to get around zoning is more predictable. You can't just do it from full screen. But Dragon Ball FighterZ does have the ability to force neutral to end at any time through Vanish and many other attacks, meaning that you have to zone a lot more actively and with a lot more understanding of your beam timings and general type of flow in the opponent's case to actually succeed at it. If you find yourself wanting to play pure zoning in this game, or at least to experiment with it, the characters you're likely to need are a little unintuitive because the way that they are represented both in the lore of the show and in your own understanding of what they are when you see them played by most people don't match up at all. They have the capacity But because when most people talk about zoning in this game, they're talking about very active zoning. They're not generally referring to the sort of team required to do this.
Get ready for a Dragon Ball Rumble! Ready? Fight! まだまだだね。どうかな。さあ行くよ。それ。いいそれ。開いた。もっといって。それ。いい。頼むよ。
For example, Beerus is a much more active zoner and is more of a space control character than a zoner for most people in the first place. While Beerus can control where on the screen the opponent is able to occupy, he does have some blind spots, first of all, and he has a lot of setup required in order to get particular parts of the screen covered. Whereas, Goku doesn't really have this problem in the same way, because even though Goku does have to move in order to do it, you generally can expect that Goku has some other options to open you up a little more cleanly than that. This is probably why there were changes made to Beerus Crouch Medium, because without it he doesn't have a lot of options for making the opponent respect his ability to move around enough to bother trying to get closer to him or trying to stay out of particular ranges. Footsie characters, or neutral characters like Kid Buu and Vegeta Blue, are therefore able to push on Beerus a little bit more than most can, simply because the space he needs to occupy, he can't stay there. He has to drop back into a position where they can hit him just for a moment, and with a good enough timing they will be able to manage to flip him when they need to.
バカめ調子に乗るなアドだ生きてなめるなよこんなものかファイナルスペシャルこの痛み決して忘れるなその痛み決して忘れるな
As you can see, because one can super dash through Beerus' attack, he has to control space by also taking other actions or relying on his assist. The orbs are not sufficient on their own. However, they do set up a very good job of trapping the opponent into situations where they think they have options. And once Beerus has the correct spacing, there's very little way to deal with him. He is a very active zoner in that once he puts out his orbs and traps, he knows that you must either super dash through them, which you can't just do if he is waiting for you, or you have to let him act fairly freely. This allows him to space himself and spend those moments getting into positions he prefers, making your life relatively difficult. Beerus' various tiny hops, backdashes, and other aerial positioning mean that you have to constantly be tracking him, and he has to constantly be moving to prevent you from tracking him. Which means that he is less of a keep-away character, and more of a very strange form of full-screen rushdown. Because you must always be acting, you must always be trying to open your opponent up or forcing them to block. And you must always be doing your best to take advantage of where they try to get to on the screen, based on where you basically allowed them to try to get to. Noting that any opponent on the ground basically can only super dash in one way, making it fairly easy for Beerus to control their motion. Therefore, understanding when your opponent is controlling your spacing enough to the point where you can't actually do anything is important to help you understand when you should be moving a bit more randomly, even though it might get you a little hurt sometimes. There are some players who are experts at making sure that no matter what you do, you're technically always making the wrong decision because the spacing that they have left you at has no immediate right decision to be made in the first place.
Get ready for a Dragon Ball Rumble!
This matchup, for example, is mostly about where Broly tries to get to, as opposed to anything Trunks does. Trunks basically has to hit either stand heavy or crouch heavy for most of this matchup. But this all is depending on the fact that Broly doesn't really have very good attacks from far away, and he's too tall to actually hit Trunks with his, effectively his zoning. The good range on Trunks' normals, plus the spacing he puts other people in when he uses them, allows for fairly heavy control in situations that you'd expect to have a relatively even position. Trunks' position is automatically superior by virtue of his range, whereas Krillin handles things like the corner pressure, and as you can see, Trunks is brought back in when the meter runs out to do more or less more of the same. Build it back up, use his range to keep other people under control and in position, and use his various approach tools to reposition himself in ways that the opponent can't deal with immediately. As you can see, Cell actually has a bit of trouble with Trunks if you take the standard approach for how Cell functions. This is primarily because a lot of Cell's more oppressive attacks don't hit that space that Trunks occupies when he does his flip. Similar for Krillin's after image, even though Krillin tends to get hit a bit more often than Trunks does. This freedom of movement afforded to Trunks also means it's easier to switch in whoever you feel will be able to handle the enemy. But of course, strategically, this means that Trunks gets worn down very slowly over time, and you have to conserve the amount of time you need him in by trying to deal with meter correctly. That said, when you find those moments, he is able to do a lot of work for you. And in this case, once one character is down and Trunks is no longer needed to deal with Cell specifically, you can leave it up to Krillin and his general capacity to avoid Broly, to after image through certain Broly things and so on, to hold off Broly and 16. If absolutely necessary, Trunks can reappear at the end to finish the job if all of the meter runs out. The general perspective being that if the meter runs out, that Adult Gohan and Krillin have already done all they can, and it's up to Trunks to manage to finish without any. This can also be why sparking is saved for this sort of situation, because it would either have gone to Trunks with the opponent's meter being low, or when you see the opponent's meter reaching a certain point, activated for Adult Gohan just to make sure things stay within a range you can control. But Trunks is not needed in the end. Enough meter is available to overcome Broly's extremely strong oppression with level 3 and clinched victory. So now we're going to demonstrate the unconventional approach as mentioned before. If one's wish is generally to defend and just zone, Goku is a good option, but we decided to change more of the team to give some insight into why Frieza must move around a lot. Sixteen's ability to trap with his various grabs is very good for dealing with people who want to approach but can't be beaten in other ways. Because the grabs have a tendency to have a good forward hit potential, you can use them to set up a lot of situations that otherwise would feel weird. If you are used to playing Ken or Ryu, for example, basically the ability to grab someone just because they have tried to approach you from the ground or the air and understand which of those two things you need to do is generally more helpful than Goku's ability to defend himself from close, for example. Or, now you can see the contrast that aside from Frieza's crouch heavy, which is incredibly good and was probably buffed even better, he doesn't have as much control over that sort of approach from full screen. Frieza absolutely can hit you when he knows where you're going to be, but if you can change your momentum at all, Frieza tends to be in a lot worse situation. Frieza is better at moving himself around and catching people who have put themselves in places that he recognizes. He's more of a thinker in these things. So as you can see, controlling space with Frieza is a lot about understanding and constantly moving yourself. Whereas with 16, you just get to react, think more about where your opponent is going to try to be. And if they're not moving, just throw out some rocket punches at them. Once you force your opponent to want to approach you though, Frieza's relatively effective at this because you just have to predict where they're going to be. Hit is also able to zone in some very interesting ways. Specifically, once he's used one of his moves to go into his time skip stance, he can do punches from there, or he can catch you from far away if he expects that you're going to try to defend yourself too much. He's also very good at moving very far, very quickly, and keeping the opponent very far away from him. Furthermore, his special attack is not in fact an attack at all, and functionally will just act as a parry, meaning that you don't have to deflect with hit, you just get a free attack out of it. Making sure that you understand which of the characters in this game parallels to any game you've played before, or that you are dedicated to developing a style based on one of the 2 or 3 ways to play the character, is how to keep yourself from being frustrated at the game itself. It's often true that you tend to feel limited by what the game allows you to do when you have a particular method of play in mind, when it might just be that you're either playing the wrong characters or thinking about options that the characters have in ways that don't necessarily have to be the way you use them. This is true of assists, supers, basically everything about them. It can be very difficult when you start off to keep all of your options in mind, specifically when you have things like Vanish to get you out of weird pressure situations like this one. It's easier to think, I just want to defend, but oppressive rushdown characters will just beat you out of this because they have suppression and footsies. You actually have to very proactively decide, I'm getting out. But as you can see, this doesn't work very well for Frieza. If Frieza either defends too long or moves immediately, he tends to die. You have to have a very strong understanding of evasion to play Frieza well. Hit, however, does not necessarily require that. Hit only requires that stance, as you've just seen. When used with his medium button, that basically means that Hit can't be hit for a certain amount of time. Once Hit has entered that stance, you can use the standard Hadouken style motion to do various ranged attacks. Some of them actually cause Hit to move, and some of them don't. But as a generality, if you want a character that doesn't have to move much at all, this is probably the character for you, because he can clear so much space on the screen with just normals if necessary. If you're not the type that likes walking, Just hits medium punch or something, and you can cross half the screen at one shot. This can often throw off opponents who don't know what else to do with themselves when you are in positions like this one, because your spacing is always unpredictable. Using this to your advantage as much as possible allows you to defeat other defensive players without getting too stressed about it. You can probably see from the contrast that it would be harder to do this sort of thing with the other characters from before, because moving with them is so ingrained into the requirement. You must always move into position A to prepare for the use of moves to stop your opponent from approaching you. Whereas these characters tend to care less about where they are on the screen and can focus on where the opponent is, or where the opponent is about to be. Frieza himself does have to fight from mid-screen or on offense in order to achieve this in most cases, but if he has enough meter, he can just cover basically the entire screen with his super and not worry about attackers much. He's therefore a good point character if you can play him evasively, and a much worse point character if you don't want to move. Hence the previous mention of Frieza's warp attack. Frieza can use this to move himself on any recovery. It's basically just able to make your opponent not know where Frieza is, because they're not necessarily expecting that he has disappeared. For characters like Goku who just cover one's entire swath of the screen, this is not very helpful. But for characters like Beerus who are specifically about making sure that they pin you down, Frieza's ability to do this means that he can violate those expectations fairly easily and then just go back to zoning. While Hit does not have the ability to move in the same way, Hit's bonus is that he doesn't have to move at all, as just demonstrated. He just becomes intangible, so he doesn't care. Since Hit can also attack from that stance, and the attack that he uses from that stance is a zoning attack, his spacing is much less relevant to anything. You don't care where Hit is relative to the opponent because he is one that covers a whole swath of the screen if you do this. As long as you have enough time, therefore, to use Hit's time skip, you can't be hurt until you choose to attack, and if you simply choose never to attack, it doesn't come up. If your opponent is far away from you, any attempt they make to approach you allows you to launch the attack that Hit can do from there, which covers so much space they probably can't get to you anyway. As you get higher level, the opponent becomes more able to see through this, or they just don't stay far enough away from it that you can worry about it. Because he's much like Chip from Guilty Gear, once you're close enough, this stops working. He doesn't have time to start up that stance, or doesn't have time to make sure that he will hit them when they dash over his head or whatever. But at full screen, it is safe to just do that attack, and as long as you're not really devoted to trying to beat up your opponent with it, he just gets to stay there and relax. If your opponent mistimes their own attack, he can just use his special button to parry them even after coming out of that stance.
It's all or nothing. Let's go.
The danger of playing these characters, as opposed to the others, is their relatively worse lows and stand heavy attacks. Even though the stand heavy attack of Android 16, for example, reaches quite far, it also brings him fairly far forward and is more difficult to use as a footsie button than most. In short, if you give him enough time to stand at the other side of the screen, you really can't do too much to him. You must use your own beams to counter it, and given the startup, if he started before you, chances are it's not going to work. Your own beam is going to get caught, so you must move forward, giving the hit player more time to feel comfortable to call in assist to defend himself and so on. Once you are closer, however, it becomes much more manageable as a character to deal with. Because of the long recovery on his special. So do bear that in mind. Frieza is about violating expectations. If you find yourself focused on targeting your opponent rather than evading their targeting, this may not be the character for you in the long term. Especially since even when he does warp around, he doesn't lead into much. He doesn't do a lot of damage. He doesn't get to set up a lot of moves. It is there to make your opponent frustrated and riff and cause weird things. Therefore, we have classed Frieza as the evasive zoner and Beerus as the setup one. The difference between Amara's style and my style of Frieza, for example, is that in many of the situations where you see her attempt to hit the opponent with another death ball, that is the moment where I would have moved, primarily because of the difference in goals. My assumption is that the opponent will just block, and the death ball will do me no good, or they'll vanish and make my situation worse. Her assumption is that if she launches the attack, they will have to keep quiet, which is true, but you don't need Frieza for that. And due to his lack of really good options for covering the situations where the opponent does get hit, or is patient enough to just wait out a lot of that, He's at least a slightly suboptimal choice for this type of zoning. The long charge up of the Death Ball and Death Saucer also mean that the opponent can slip through if they have a good idea of what move is coming. There we go. Similarly here, you will be able to see the difference in general styles of Android 16 play that come up out of this. While the Wolf's general way of moving with Android 16 tends to be the same, the focus at key moments is a lot more about getting into an oppressive position than it is about respacing to keep the opponent out longer. Android 16 is also not a particularly easy character to do this with, but one can over time learn the ranges of his moves and the specifics of the targeting. And for the most part, once you have learned those things, activating the move means the move is very likely to hit within the space of time you require. As you can see with Frieza, this is not the case. You generally have to know beforehand where your opponent is going to move to, rather than just trying to attack where they are. One good example is the fact that in any case where Frieza has thrown a Death Ball on knockdown so far, you could have jumped over it, because he takes so long to charge up the Death Ball. Note the almost immediate forward movement, and focus in a belief that the opponent is not going to move. This works because when you assume the opponent is not going to move and do certain things, you can also assume that if they did move, you probably still got them because you know where to go afterwards. Frieza's lack of strong mix-ups after Super Dash also puts a damper on how effective he can be in that style of play, because you then have to dash back out anyway, knowing what your opponent will do, but having no real attack of your own that you can easily launch. This situation, for example, after that knockdown, a zoning Frieza has very few real options, leading to this sort of situation we see here.
The battle's about to start. Good luck.
So for example, against Kid Buu, matchup-wise, if you want to zone, since it's almost impossible to keep him there, your best option is actually to call Hit, because Hit can get through all of his stuff.
Are you ready?
Of course, you'll get Hit doing that, but it still helps. But this is again about wanting to play the defensive form. Trying to play offensive Hit against Kid Buu is a nightmare. Kid Buu's footsies and general positioning are just too good to deal with it, whereas Hit will eventually counter him, send him flying, and get enough space to do what he wants. Kid Buu must therefore slow down the entire style of attack that you see here, or be willing to go ham and hope that it works. Frieza has advantage against Kid Buu primarily because Kid Buu tends to extend himself in ways that Frieza gets to hit often, but not because any of the things previously mentioned about Frieza's fighting style have changed. Similarly, 16 is reasonably strong against Gohan because he has decent range on his normals, and a lot of the things Gohan does is easy for 16 to get out of relatively with his armored attacks and stand heavy. Similarly, it's just safer for 16 to do things on certain forms of Wake Up against Gohan than most other characters because he knows even if he gets hit, it's probably not going to lead to a terrible situation. This fight, on the other hand, is kind of painful, but only when 16 is not in the air. As you can see, one of the primary problems is that once Frieza is not far from Kid Buu anymore, he simply doesn't have the speed of zoning required to do this. 16's speed of zoning, however, works out quite well, again, if 16 is in the air when he's throwing his rocket punches. As you can see there, Kid Buu would probably have some problems with this because Kid Buu's attacks don't generally cover that spot on the screen. Vegeta Blue is much better off in that regard. And much harder for 16's attacks to track as a generality.
礼は言わんぞ。この戦いを通じて俺はもっと強くなった。
So pay as much attention as you can to how your opponent's flow goes, so that you can tell whether or not you're losing because of characters or something else, or some combination of the two things. We are at the halfway point of the stream, which means that we'll have our usual reshuffle, which means that we'll probably be playing this last match from this side. And moving into more discussion, more in discussion of matchups and similar.
Get ready for a Dragon Ball Rumble.
It may seem as if we've been doing that already, but that's mostly been about character choices and ways to approach fights, more so than the actual specifics of matchups, which normally involves a lot more use of assists, what space you want to cover, and how much meter you use on particular things.
Ready? Let's go.
Since you can expect Beerus to want to move away as a generality, Kid is in a much better position against this character as well, because Beerus again must land eventually. And if you learn the timing for him getting into the air to throw out an orb, you can catch him when he lands and solve your problem altogether, since the orbs disappear once Beerus lands. Beerus must therefore spend a lot more time deciding exactly which attack to use. And, as noted before, from that stance where it does have the blue around him, if standard Hadouken style motion will launch a different attack altogether. One that will generally stress Beerus out enough that he has to care. Whereas Frieza, who doesn't target that space on the screen that Beerus occupies very well, must violate his expectations, walk around the place a ton, get into a position where he can launch an attack through the orbs, but just doing this is never going to get him anywhere. Once he does do this, however, Beerus doesn't have a lot of options, because Beerus doesn't have good advantage against Frieza at mid-range at all. And getting back to long range means that Frieza is free to launch the attacks that he couldn't launch before. This also means that, unlike most characters, Frieza can absolutely keep up with Beerus in meter by launching attacks that he doesn't expect to specifically do anything. So, despite anything mentioned in previous streams, please understand that while Frieza is absolutely a zoning character, he may not be what you expect from zoners in most games. If you come from Street Fighter and so on, the concept of zoner in those games does not necessarily apply to Frieza. But with our rearranging of the team members on stream now, we'll be looking more at some of the other changes that have been made to various characters in the game. Particularly, the Vegeta assist now has quite a few ways out of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the assist itself has been weakened, but rather that the way it has to be used has been changed fairly drastically. If your team was relying on Vegeta's assist for its lockdown, you may want to change to a character who suits the team better overall, because the strength of the assist is now determined by whether or not you benefit from your opponent trying to get out of it as well. In this case, however, we're going back to dealing with the offensive strength characters, one in terms of mix-ups and rushdown, and the other in terms of aggression.
俺も結構やるじゃん。これでも少しは腕を上げたんだからさ。
The outcome of this fight is anybody's guess! It's all or nothing!
Now it is of course true that unless the opponent is willing to challenge Vegeta's assist in the first place, it's really not that different to you. However, Gotenks is a character who benefits strongly from Vegeta's assist regardless of the situation because of the way his motion functions. Since you cannot tell whether or not Gotenks is ready to launch an attack when he moves into the air, but are forced to either try to get out of or block Vegeta. And since Gotenks can counter-attack you from the air fairly easily regardless of whether or not you did your super dash to get through it, he's the ideal character to go along with the Vegeta assist in either form because he doesn't care about what you actually try to do. If you try to super dash through and he blocks, you will be counter-attacked in ways that most other characters cannot. Cell has a bit more trouble with the counter-attack, but he can still definitely throw out some difficulty on you when you are faced with the Vegeta assist if Cell happens to be in the air at the time. Using those assists to change your opponent's concept of how the match can go means that they will end up frustrated faster and try to spend more time looking for mistakes you are making. This makes it easier to trick them into believing that mistakes have been made, and you still have Vegeta to cover you with invincible stuff, or just there to pick up some health while doing it. It's relatively difficult for non-zoners to counter-attack Vegeta at all when he's called in as an assist, meaning that he doesn't need a lot of health to make sure that he isn't defeated. You only need to worry once your opponent has enough level 3 and a big beam to cover the whole screen. You can even use this to bait the level 3 at the cost of some of Vegeta's health, which really won't matter since level 3s are all blue damage, and as long as Vegeta has enough health, he'll just end up healing it in the background while you continue to fight with your main character who probably blocked the resulting level 3, maybe even punished it. All of these aspects worked before, but because of the timings that Vegeta's assist was likely to be used before, they were less likely to be seen as primary aims for it, and it does require certain characters to be as helpful as possible, because otherwise you can't push your opponents to make certain reactions.
結構やるじゃん。俺は無天老師様の弟子なんだ。この程度のやつに負けてたまるか。
In the matchup between the measured player and the oppressive player, the main thing that's deciding who is going to win is how quickly the oppressive player adapts to the current position of their measured opponent. The measured player does not have the same strength against the oppressive player if the oppressive player has armored moves or just good attack vectors that can avoid the main ones used by most people. They get to spend more space walking forward, pushing on certain buttons, super dashing, to prevent situations that are otherwise bad for them. And they do this by using tools that are a bad idea for most other people to use in the first place. For example, Brawly, as mentioned before, can effectively super dash all day, and most characters can do very little about it consistently. Beerus does have better options than most, but for the most part, yeah, Brawly can still super dash at Beerus whenever he wants. Android 16 does not have the same option because he mostly just has armor on particular things, and even some of this will slightly change. But if it's not Beerus that he's up against, this works decently well regardless, because he only needs to care about whether or not the opponent is far enough away that they wouldn't be able to break his armor if they tried. Once they are in that position, There's no reason to hesitate, basically. They could just attack regardless of anything else, and expect the situation will at least turn out neutral for him. Not an option that many other less armored characters have. Being able to approach quickly and grab certain types of opponent's moves also lets him space himself differently than other characters can afford to. Meaning that since Beerus cannot measure where exactly he needs to be on the screen as easily, it takes him a lot more effort to get into the right space. As you can see here, he tends to end up relying a lot more on his meter, which is good if he has enough of it, but if you can prevent him from being able to use it, or do a lot of damage to him while he's still on point when there is not much meter available, you will find yourself in a lot worse situations. The thing you care about the most in this matchup, therefore, is making sure that you don't give Beerus a reason to believe he can just come forward safely himself. Because once he gets this impression, due to you overcommitting, he's not a weak character on the approach, he's a weak character in terms of opening you up once he's closer. But if you're opening yourself up, Beerus doesn't care, he'll just take that and you will have to deal with it. But unlike 16, as you can see, Broly's difficulty in covering the air above him means that knocking people into certain situations, especially when they have aerial attacks and Broly's health is lower, means that he also must either super dash again or jump and immediately super dash to keep up that oppression. This is your general option for using Broly against characters who can easily do this. It does not work as well on Frieza, and it does not work as well on Android 18. But overall, once you have knocked your opponent back with Broly, take advantage of the fact that he can effectively super dash without stress a lot of the time, and jump straight up and follow them.
It's all or nothing.
俺も少しは役に立つかもしれない。行くぞ。行くぞ。そこだな。行くぞ。行くぞ。問題ない。行くぞ。楽しませてくれよ。甘いな。行くぞ。そう受け止める勇気があるか。
The other benefit of this particular form of flow with Gotenks is that getting the opponent to the corner with Gotenks using assists isn't even necessary. Once Gotenks has managed to hit you and put you on a defense, his Galactic Donut is generally frustrating enough to deal with for someone who doesn't want to try to jump out of the way, and he doesn't have to worry about too much. Even more importantly, Vegeta's general capacity to catch people in his Dragon Rush means that if you play without Dragon Rush and using other pressure on your other characters, making the opponent more likely to get into the mental state of blocking most of the time, Vegeta becomes more effective simply because of the way that your opponent has started to think. With or without his assist, he can still function in this sort of group of characters who spend a lot of time forcing long block strings. In the scenario where your opponent wants to launch mid-range attacks, Vegeta becomes even stronger as an assist, because these mid-range attacks often take long enough to start that even if they do land, Vegeta will continue his assault. Note that since the hit stun of Vegeta's assist was not really changed, him managing to land anything means that you have a good chance of recovering out of whatever your opponent wants to do in neutral, and if not necessarily managing to get a counter attack even after it, certainly enough spacing to keep yourself safe from a lot of things. Opponents who move around too much, therefore, can be defeated simply by putting Vegeta on screen to take up that space so that if they fall back into it or choose not to move, they'll be in more trouble. And the amount of time that you can call him when you expect him to block is really not as relevant for a character or player who you think is going to try to stay in position. It is basically now that you no longer get knockdowns from this assist, lockdowns from this assist, and have to spend more time thinking about how to use him to set up positions that benefit you. But once again, good fortune comes out of the fact that once Vegeta does try to get close to you, the other player knows that he has so many strange and potentially good options that their best option, normally, is to block. If you can distract them, especially with your other assists, it's fairly easy for Vegeta to get his Dragon Rush. And teams such as this, with long beams and lock-ons, means that you can spend more time trying to set that up, and your opponent is even more encouraged to just keep blocking. Cell is also extremely strong at helping hold positions long enough for assists to become available without the opponent being able to do a whole lot to punish him for doing it. You'll note, for example, that the Vegeta assist is already back and has been back for some time. To the point where Gold Tank can just call well, whatever. The short answer is that he can call Vegeta really often relative to other characters, as long as his goal is not necessarily to cause the same sort of lockdown that the character was used for before. Once Vegeta is in a situation like this, calling the other assists basically sets up everything else Vegeta needs because his spacing is so much better for Dragon Rush than most characters. And there it is back again. This also allows you to spend a lot of time building up meter that would otherwise be stressful. Vegeta also gets to use Dragon Rush as a counter to a lot of things and grab opponents who have reached the end of their block strings because they're too aware that they can't necessarily continue those block strings. He has an invincible move and he has really good supers. He's not really the sort of character you can pressure a lot. Even some of his normals are likely to reach at the end of block strings better than most characters, meaning that you have to be ready to tech out of the Dragon Rush. However, Vegeta is at advantage positionally after that as well, making it even easier. So if you want to continue using this character despite all these nerfs to his assist, just bear in mind whether or not the other members of your team have the following traits. Or, of course, make it work some way yourself, but if you just want to be able to decide, should I switch my assist? If your characters already put on a lot of pressure and buy a lot of time, there's really no reason to swap Vegeta out. All you have to think about is how good they are at counter-attacking after air blocking on their side. If they are very poor at counter-attacks after air block, for example, Piccolo is terrible at this, you may not want to be using Vegeta as your assist, but it was a good chance you weren't using Vegeta as your assist for Piccolo anyway. In general, if you use Cell and Vegeta on your team, there's no reason as yet to switch Vegeta out. The things you do will have to change, and your overall strength of the team may be different, but swapping to a character like Adult Gohan is not likely to be very helpful to you because despite the fact that he's not too heavily nerfed, he really doesn't get to do the same sort of things, and neither does Kid Buu. So if you really want to do things like that, and make your opponent miserable with mix-ups that come out of your own blocking, keep Vegeta. Especially since there's no point in giving up all that training you probably did for monitoring your assist timers. You might as well just convert it into something else.
It's time to face your opponent.
In this matchup, for example, Beerus is actually heavily troubled by Gotenks' ability to move out of the way of a ton of stuff, while still calling Vegeta or Cell to attack Beerus whenever Beerus touches down. Their ability to stop Beerus from moving in particular situations allows Gotenks to reposition himself to get through a lot of Beerus' pressure, without having to worry that he will never actually manage to catch up to Beerus. The same thing happens with Cell when he's in this position, because honestly Gotenks isn't really that different. He's not as good at the lockdown, but with Beerus you're not really looking for the lockdown, you're more so looking for that moment where Beerus is vulnerable because he needs to start his next setup, and you can make sure that he does not by calling your assist to prevent him from actually achieving it. This forces Beerus to block and stay on the defense way longer, and that is a terrible thing for a character who doesn't deal well with being Dragon Rushed. As for Vegeta, he can do this himself. And since Vegeta is relatively strong against Beerus for that ability if nothing else, Gotenks covers the rest of it, given that, again, Gotenks assist homes in. Vegeta can target the ground and wait for problems to occur for Beerus when he's in a different position. Unlike most characters, they also do a good job of covering Vegeta's position there. The one flaw in Gotenks we would say is probably that he doesn't manage to handle people who are dragon rushing at him as well, since they will tend to get out. But as you can see, that situation eventually wears down the other side because there's just too many assists to deal with. As you'll note, they're back already. But your aim should no longer be to throw out heavy offense because of these assists, but rather to use them as cover and be as confusing as possible. Sparking Blast therefore makes this team even stronger in that regard. It's just too hard to keep up with the assist speed. Meaning that for this team, using Sparking while one character is still alive, at least, is actually better because you're getting a different benefit from it. With Cell removed from the equation, not much changes. The only thing that really changes is how often you can actually call the assist. Both Gotenks and Vegeta are able to do the same sort of full-screen lock-on style attack required to keep this up. The opponent must drop back eventually off their back jump or even forward jump, meaning that you can easily set up things like Galactic Donut and not have to go anywhere near them to manage to win. In fact, approaching characters like Team Gohan is usually the quickest way to lose, because they'll eventually tire themselves out. You don't have to do that much. This is again the problem of trying to catch an opponent to lock on to someone who is constantly moving, which is the difficult feat in this game. If you spend too much time trying to attack where your opponent is, they're likely to not be there by the time you arrive, especially if you are fighting from full screen. This is why your assists are helpful in this situation. It's easier, much easier, to just do nothing for long periods and wait for your moment to arrive, and in Vegeta's case, as you see here, once again, the Dragon Rush will normally save the rest. It's important to think of assists in terms of team structure, even more so now that the question of what is the best assist is no longer mostly everyone giving you the same answer. Broly, of course, is much less intimidated by this setup of assists. He can use his powered shell, he can armor through certain ones, he can launch a lot of attacks that don't really help there. But if Cell is the one that is on screen, this problem basically goes away for the player. Cell is too capable of just staying in the air away from Broly altogether and making him miserable with effectively the equivalent of zoning. When you finally decide to try to counterattack Cell, at that moment, the assists start to actually help again. If you don't know what to do because your opponent is approaching and you don't think you're in the right position, that is the moment Cell just calls an assist and deals with Broly that way. Another good way to use it is if Cell wants to jump away but doesn't feel as if he has the timing. Fulfilling both of the functions at once. Cell's attempt to jump away while covered by Vegeta's assist, even if your opponent does super dash, they will be blocked. And once the opponent is blocked in the air, Cell has a ton of advantages in scrambles, in spacing, in other situations. This allows him to be used as a defensive assist for Cell in ways that he might not complement other characters as easily. Gotenks does not have as much to go with here, but because Gotenks has so much aerial mobility as a whole, he doesn't have to worry about this in the first place, and can in fact use Vegeta's assist to cover his approaches after his knockdowns. This does not work if Gotenks calls the assist immediately because his knockdowns are usually too far out, but if Gotenks knocks you down, moves forward, and pauses to call the assist, this is actually relatively difficult to execute for some people, because otherwise you will end up switching into Vegeta like that. But if you can get it done, most of the time the result will be that the opponent wants to counterattack the approaching Gotenks to make sure that he doesn't do anything too ridiculous, but basically can't do it other than to try to super dash through the nerfed Vegeta assist. But Since Gotenks can easily see this, and because he can dodge out of the way of a lot of things himself, he doesn't care. Since Gotenks also has much more capacity to easily cover those spaces on the screen regardless of whether or not he's in the air, the assist is not as necessary. Overall, everyone, make sure not to push yourself too hard to try to fit into what you're hearing is necessary. Even if you are a bit frustrated at the apparent ease of play of others or other teams, do remember that the way to actually play these teams is not necessarily the thing that is solving the problem for them. It might be that they have a different understanding of how they want to play, and it might be that they have a different understanding of how to beat your characters. You may not be able to have the same success by switching to that team yourself, unless you have a similar style or way of thinking about the game.
やるじゃん。俺は無天老師様の弟子なんだ。この程度のやつに負けてたまるか。
The interaction between a character who is less capable of doing quick lockdown, such as Nappa, is a little bit harder for Vegeta users. However, it's not that different given that Nappa didn't benefit that much from the lockdown before, except to use it to put down Cybermen in timings that were probably not a good idea to do it anyway. One has to corner the opponent quite a bit before that becomes a directly good idea, and it's easier to just ask Cell to do it because you only need around that same amount of time anyway.
Are you ready?
せいぜい楽しませてくれ。楽しめそう。少しはやるようだな。甘いな。問題ない。殲滅する。無駄だ。そうだな。行くぞ。あがけあがけ。甘い。見切った。行くぞ。行くぞ。落ちろ。無駄だ。そこだな。さてと。こっちだ。甘いな。すぐ楽に。見切った。
We've covered the specific use of Nappa assist in previous streams, but it is true that he's probably not a versatile enough or strong enough, by certain standards, assist to make it worth considering him as an option for Vegeta. I mean, to replace Vegeta in your team, obviously. Note, however, that he is good at helping you end your block strings and change your positioning as a result of it, which may be useful for some people. If your main reason for having Vegeta on the team is to safely get out of your own pressure when your block string has gone on for too long, there are many characters who do a decent job of this. But if you happen to enjoy Nappa's playstyle, he might be someone you can call in for this purpose because he's actually quite good at it. Both sides of that exchange needed to make sure that they understood the risks and benefits of Raw Vanish, in order to make those decisions. Do remember that height is often mentioned by us to be a fairly weak option, but once your opponent is low enough on life that will kill them, it switches to being an extremely strong one.
A fierce showdown is about to begin! Ready? Fight it out!
覚悟はいいかくそ終わりだくそ行くぞくそ行くぞそのが行くぞ終わりだ覚悟はいいか行くぞ終わりだもうどこへ行く終わりだ何なんだお前の思い通りにはさせんいくぞ立て直すそこだなそこは任せたぞどうだいそろそろ死にたいかその調子その調子そこだなそこ見切ったそこだな問題ないそこだな甘いですよここですよそこ宇宙の塵にしてやる
話せてもらうよ
立てないし
もっと楽しもうぜ黙っときな
すぐに終わらせてやる
まだ
さて
いやそら黙っときな
そろ
そらまだ
さて
まだ
さて次の砕け散れそろさて
驚い
無駄だ
たどうせさ感謝なんかしてないからな
この程度その調子さらなる進化を求めて正解でしたよさてくれ甘いどうしたくれ終わりだ終わりだ終わりだくれ
早く勝負をつけなきゃね
Understanding the rhythm of an opponent who will basically just keep attacking is also very important for playing this sort of character. It's often not in your best interest to prevent their attacks, but rather just to never stop doing the counter.
感謝なんかしてない
どうだいちょっと脅してやこの私にバリーを許さん虫けらがこの私にバリーを
どこ見てんのさ
カメハメ
どこ見てんのさ
カメハメ
勝たせてもらうよ
無駄だ
If your opponent realize that your opponent is basically just attacking constantly, especially when they only have one character left and you don't have to worry about the assist, your best option is normally to counter immediately with your best option for basic counters without actually trying to think through what they should be doing. Just pick your best option and repeat it until it eventually catches them. Overthinking leads to hesitation, and hesitation leads to that particular type of tactic winning. So if you're concerned that your opponent appears to be spamming in some way, overcome this by spamming yourself, but not necessarily with the expectation that whatever you do is going to win. You are just playing rock, paper, scissors at an extremely high speed and assuming that because they don't actually have time to reposition themselves, that you will come out on top eventually once you've figured out the right option. If you realize that your opponent is taking a little bit of time between their attacks, however, you might be facing a measured player rather than the aggressive type and need to think more about whether or not you can get out of the way instead.
Brace yourself for the coming battle.
Exploring your character's options can lead to a lot of confusing situations in which you're getting hit, but feel as if it should have worked. Don't cling to this too hard, just keep on trying different things until you've found it, because it's difficult to set up these same sorts of situations without knowing the opposing characters very well, in training and similar. So take the opportunity to just figure out what can beat the spam, if anything, and hope that you will come out on top in future games.
It's all or nothing.
This particular relatively intense match is most likely our last match for the night. Tune in tomorrow for probably content for some other random game. It might be Uniest again, it might be Tekken. But it will definitely not be Street Fighter bot content or kata content, as we're still developing the latest kata. However, you can join us Monday next week for said Street Fighter content on Mishmashing Battle Lounge. Same time, sure, slightly about an hour less duration normally. And Tuesday for Guilty Gear. Wednesday is once again likely to be our Sandbag Casuals segment, helping you improve at Street Fighter, or just giving you things to think about. And finally, Next week, Thursday, we'll be back with more Kame House lobbies.
そう人の死なせてもらう
逃がさないぞ
さくらえ
どうだ
さて
僕を加重しますよっいっぱい飛ばすぞ
さてこの私にバリアが
まいったこの時とは違うぞ
Looking quite close, 6 meter on one side, 1 meter on the other. Instant use of 3 of those meters. But that instant use also brings us to the end of our stream. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK.
戦いの勘が鈍ってるな
Do your best you can with your practice, and therefore, good night, everyone.